Free agency is almost here, and some major names are about to hit the market. These are the players teams will move fast to sign the moment that the window opens, but every position has true difference makers available this year. If you want to understand where the biggest impact is coming from, stick around because in this video, I'll break down the best free agents in the NFL, top 10 at every position. So let's start right at the top. Number one on our free agent wide receiver board, it's George Pickens. Now, there's a very high likelihood that he gets franchise tagged by the Dallas Cowboys immediately, but let's still look at the profile. He just put up a legit top 5 production season, 93 catches, 1,400 yards, which was third in the league, and 9 touchdowns. So this wasn't just like empty calories, that sort of thing. I remember watching him in 2025. It felt structurally different than it did in his early years in Pittsburgh. It wasn't just him making circus catches down the sideline on go routes anymore. It was just basically him averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game, 5th best at the position. But here's the stat that should make your ears perk up a little bit. Dallas, who traded for him, obviously, didn't just use him, they featured him. He had 23 red zone targets. That's prime Devontae Adams territory. It really is, and that's why he was number one. NFL teams pay a massive amount of money for guys who will tilt the field in the scoring area like that. Red zone targets are the most valuable currency in fantasy football, period. They're just worth a lot more, significantly more than targets between the 20s because that's where the touchdowns live. So the fact that he was earning that usage proves that this isn't just a field stretcher anymore. He's a complete ex-receiver, but there's still kind of that lingering narrative, right? That boomer bust label, that head case label, that he's a cancer on the team, all of those things that he will just disappear at moments where he decides to stop trying. I feel like some of the listeners might be kind of scared to draft him in the late first or early second round next year, just because they kind of remember the weeks where he did kind of disappear a little bit. And that's definitely a valid fear if you're kind of basing it on 2023, 2024. I guess there were times in 2025 where he showed us that, but he also showed us something fundamentally different. The boom weeks aren't just random with Pickens anymore. They're basically a feature of his skill set. I mean, just look at some of his ceiling games. In week 4, 134 yards, 2 touchdowns. That's 33 half PPR points per game. That's contract winning game tape, but he also stacked multiple 140 yard plus games in week 11 and week 12. So it wasn't really just like this 1 week heater that people talk about. He became the absolute engine of this Dallas Cowboys offense. So if I'm sitting in my home league draft in August, there's a chance that if Pickens is sitting there, I'm drafting him pretty early and really just running with him as my wide receiver 1. I think at the very least, he's a high-end wide receiver 2, especially if he lands on a team where he's the clear number 1 option, or if he stays in Dallas as the focal point alongside of CeeDee Lamb. He's a wide receiver 1 either way. I think you drag him right into that alpha conversation, and if you still think of him as that volatile wide receiver 2, you're basically playing fantasy football in the past. So if you catch up to the data, 137 targets. He ran nearly 600 routes. That's volume that you can bank on, right? And that's number 1. Moving on to number 2, this is a name that absolutely terrifies people right now, but the name value is massive and the risk is undeniable. Tyreek Hill. He's the high risk, high reward play of the entire offseason, so we should just address this elephant in the room immediately. He was completely derailed by injury. Obviously, the late ACL tear and dislocated knee was not ideal. It was definitely ugly. I remember seeing it happen live. It was one of those moments where it was completely silent in the entire stadium. You kind of just knew his season was over, and he's going to be, 32 when the season starts. So you can kind of see that age cliff colliding with like the major injury cliff, and it's not great. For most players, that's a recipe for a massive do not draft label for me. So why the hell is he number 2 on this list? I mean, are we just chasing some past glory here? No, I think we're just chasing upside. But before that injury, at least the first 4 games of 2025, if you look at the numbers, 21 catches, 265 yards, and a touchdown. I think it says a lot more about Tua Tagovailoa and what this offense was trying to do in general with Tyreek than necessarily that he was in any sort of decline. He was on pace for a totally normal Tyreek year, and he was basically going for a pacing for over 1,100 yards, and he was still producing like a featured weapon. And here's the thing about his so-called down year in 2024 that people forget. Even then, when people were saying that he was losing a step, he commanded a 40.5% end zone target share. Yeah, that's completely insane. Wide receiver 8 in the entire league. So when the actual end zone targets went somewhere, they went to Tyreek, and that's the usage that people were basically writing off last year, and they're going to do it again this year, especially with the efficiency crater that everyone's kind of baking in. He wasn't taking those 5-yard slants and outrunning the angles for an 80-yard touchdown every single week, but the offense still kind of treated him like that primary finisher. So I guess if I'm going to play devil's advocate, it's going to be that if I can draft Tyreek Hill in, say, the 4th or 5th round, I guess the question I have to ask myself is, what am I actually buying? I think it's a high upside 1-year swing for a guy that basically has proven that that he can be a focal point in fantasy football for any team, and he can earn targets consistently. And I don't think just because of this injury and poor situation in Miami that's going to get changed if he ends up on a different team. If he's on the field, he's still changing the math for opposing defenses, but the risk is basically that he could be a shell of himself. He could basically start the year on the pup. Maybe he ends up in the middle rounds, and the upside is worth the gamble over some boring guy who gets you 8 points a week and clogs up your roster. So I think the risk is, we know the risks, but the upside, I think, is pretty clear here. Number 3, we have another veteran wide receiver, the constant in the NFL, Mike Evans. He had a really weird year, playing only 8 games due to injury, so that sub 1,000 yard season for the first time in his entire career did happen. The famous streak has finally been broken, but the narrative in your home league is going to be that, oh, it's over, that basically Evans is completely washed, and people are going to see that end of the year stat line, 30 catches, 368 yards, and think that he's completely done. But the age, the injury, the broken streak, and they're basically just going to fade him hard. And that's exactly where you, the smart listener, can kind of get a massive edge here, because we don't really want to look at the total season stats when we look at a guy that missed half the year. We want to look at his rates. When he was healthy, the usage was absolutely elite, 27.6% targets per route run, and that ranked 8th in the entire NFL. And if we're just looking at this, he's basically earning targets at a higher rate per route run last year than guys like CeeDee Lamb or Justin Jefferson in the games that he actually played. So he's still commanding that alpha level involvement, and his average depth of target, his ADOT, was 13.6. So he's not just catching dump offs. And this isn't a guy that's slowly transitioning into like that slow slot guy or like a pseudo tight end, something like that. He's still been holding his value on the outside. He's still winning downfield on the perimeter. He had that flash back in week 15. Remember, he came back late in the year, looked great. And in the first game, I think since week 7, he goes out, drops 6 catches, 132 yards, had a 45-yard jump ball snag that looked like vintage Mike Evans. So it's basically a skill set that teams are going to pay for in free agency. Obviously, he's got that Super Bowl pedigree. And if there is a team that has a bunch of young wide receivers, why wouldn't they, I guess, want to learn from Mike Evans? So I think the actionable advice here is if the market prices him off that ugly season, like the totals, I think you're aggressively buying the dip here. He's still Mike Evans. He's still a red zone weapon. He still wins vertically. So let your league mates draft that shiny new rookie while you take Evans 3 rounds later. I love that for us. Buy the dip. Real quick, if you're the guy in 3 or more fantasy leagues every year, you listen to pods, you read rankings, you do all the research, but you keep finishing 7 and 6 and always seem to be fighting for a playoff spot, this is for you. I made a free 3-day email series called The 3 Leaks Keeping Smart Fantasy Players Stuck in the Middle of the Pack. Each email takes about 2 minutes to read. 1 leak, 1 fix, 1 simple thing to change right now during the offseason. So if you're tired of being solid but never actually dominant in your league, go to fantasyleaks.com or hit the first link in the description. Drop in your email and I'll send you day 1 immediately. Again, it's 100% free. All right, wide receiver number 4 in free agency. This one feels like the exact opposite of Mike Evans. He's not a deep threat at all. He's kind of like a volume monster. Wan'Dale Robinson. Hear me out. Number 4, I guess he's basically like the PPR cheat code on this list. So if you play in a full PPR or half PPR league, listen up. Wan'Dale had 140 targets last year. That was 7th in the entire NFL, and that's pretty wild volume for a guy who feels like more of an afterthought, at least in the streets that I run in. He's one of those guys that ends up looking a lot better in the projections that he does typically on the field. But things kind of changed for him. He evolved a little bit. He was more than just like that check down guy, catch the ball at the line of scrimmage, like fall down for 3 yards. But last year, he posted his first 1,000-yard season. So he led the entire NFL with 543 slot snaps. He's one of those guys that ends up being the quarterback's best friend. But let me hit you with some skepticism, because I think a lot of people are probably thinking that these are just empty targets, right? Is he actually creating offense, or is the quarterback, again, just dumping it off because the offensive line is collapsing? He kind of panics. But the key here is that I think it's really just the improvement that we saw from Wan'Dale in particular. You'll see a lot of the players actually across the league say really good things about his route running ability. And then someone that I respect a lot in the wide receiver world, Matt Harmon, and his reception perception, definitely check that out. Also, has always kind of liked Wan'Dale Robinson and his separation skills. So he basically generated, if we put some numbers to this, 1.97 yards of target separation. So he's actually very open, statistically at least. He had 386 yards after the catch as well to add to that. So he gets open, he catches the ball, and then he really gets turned some of those short throws into real gains. And he's kind of like basically what I think is like an ideal fit for a team that needs like that chain mover. So even though it's free agency, it's a long way from drafting. I think the way you practically use him on your fantasy roster is that Wan'Dale ends up being kind of like that floor guy. Wide receiver 3, you can play him in your flex. He's kind of like that guy that guarantees you 10 to 12 points a week, because he's going to catch 6 or 7 balls no matter what. He stabilizes your lineup so you can take those wild swings on upside guys elsewhere, and that makes perfect sense. So I think if we just tie a bow on that, he's one of those guys that isn't going to win you your league, but he's one of those guys that can definitely give you usable weeks all season long. All right, my number 5 wide receiver in free agency. We're going to go from the floor play to the pure ceiling play. Alec Pierce. He was basically the opposite of the PPR cheat code. He was that deep threat, that guy that was basically able to be the air yards king. He had a 51.8% air yard share last year. That was first in the NFL. But let's explain air yards really quick, just because I know that probably went over a lot of your guys' heads immediately. But over 50% seems like, statistically at least, impossible, but the air yards are basically the distance that the ball travels in the air before a catch is made. So if we're looking at this, the air yard share is the percentage of teams' total air yards intended for one specific player. So basically having over 50% means that literally more than half of the entire downfield passing offense went through Alec Pierce. It's pretty insane. He wasn't just a deep threat though. He was basically like the whole vertical plan for the Colts. He's basically catching these bombs all game constantly. He put up 1,000 yards on only 84 targets. That's massive, massive efficiency, 21.3 yards per catch. But there is a little bit of a trap here because I feel like I've drafted this exact archetype before. He's like one of these players that just hits me upside the head because I have made mistakes in like chasing this type of archetype in general. So he hits that 60-yard touchdown one week, he scores 20 points, and then you start him the next week and he goes through 0 catches and 0 yards. So like that's kind of the trap. But if we're going to flip this and say that we're not just drafting for consistency, I don't think it's one of those guys that he's just going to magically start getting us 6 catches per game for 80 yards every week. But I also think that you can draft him in best ball formats where, or standard leagues where you don't need like those spike PPR performances. And I think if you look at his week 18, 4 catches, 132 yards, 2 touchdowns, he can still win you a matchup single-handedly with that type of stat line. So you have to be willing to kind of stomach the weeks where he gets you 2 targets, ruins your life. And he basically is like that specialized asset on your roster that you can throw in when you need a little bit of ceiling. And that's kind of what you're buying, and you have to know that going in. So in free agency, if he ends up in basically any of these rosters that are tied to a quarterback who can chuck the ball deep, I'm pretty interested. Number 6, Deebo Samuel. If you want to call him the gadget alpha, I'm totally okay with that. This one might upset some people a little bit, him being this high, but he was 7th in yards after catch last year, and you're still kind of getting that yards after catch type of upside with this guy. The interesting thing with Deebo, though, is how he was actually used. 54.5% of his targets were designed. So basically you're getting screens, shovel passes, jet sweeps, and the offense has to like kind of manufacture touches for him. It's not like those, like he's not winning downfield like Alec Pierce, who we were just talking about. He's winning because the offensive coordinator is actively drawing up plays specifically to get the ball in his hands at the line of scrimmage. And basically that late season fade that we saw, I think was more tied to when Marcus Mariota took over at quarterback, because Deebo's production faded pretty hard there, but the athletic profile definitely is still there. I don't necessarily think he's like system dependent at this point. He just needs a creative play caller. So we'll be keeping an eye on where he ends up. If he goes to like a generic vanilla offense that just asks him to run traditional slant and dig routes, I think he could fail for fantasy. But if he lands in like a Shanahan style system, he's still incredibly dangerous. Number 7, we have Juwan Jennings on this list. I think that you could probably call him like the red zone mercenary, but also this guy showed a ton of grit last year, playing through 5 broken ribs. So the toughness is definitely not something that can ever be in question here. And I think that if we're just going to talk through the stat line, he basically is still there. 9 touchdowns, 90 targets, despite everything that kind of happened last year. He's kind of like that perfect wide receiver 3 who can just finish drives. He had 19 red zone targets, which was 5th in the entire league. Not really a yardage guy, though. He's not going to get you 1,500 yards. He's kind of like that third down red zone specialist, kind of keeps the real life drives alive, and he scores fantasy points in a little bit more of a touchdown fashion. At 8, we have Rashid Shaheed, and he's really just the guy that gives you like that field flipping ability. He gives you at least the wide receiver value, but then also the returner value. So if you're in a league where yardage actually counts in the return game or the return scores, he gets a pretty massive bump. He had 2 return touchdowns last year, but strictly as a receiver, he's still got like a boomer bust profile, in my opinion. 19 deep ball targets. He's a better best ball candidate, in my opinion. But you can insert him into your flex when you kind of needed some upside down the stretch, or if you're in a bye week, something like that, you're desperate for that Hail Mary. I just don't know if he's going to give you like that usable weak floor that you're probably looking for where he's going to be going in drafts. My number 9 free agent wide receiver is Christian Kirk. He's kind of like that slot specialist. The regular season was pretty quiet, but man, did he get loud in the playoffs. I think if we're just looking at both of those preseason games, or those postseason games, I should say, he feels like that guy that's always kind of undervalued in drafts, but still quietly produces. He obviously is still a proven producer. He had that big 1,100-yard season back in 2022. It'll give you like a reliable floor, but can give you some spikes in some high-scoring games. So I think what I'm looking for here is if he lands on a team with a competent quarterback, I think he could be a set-it-and-forget-it wide receiver 3. And finally, rounding out the top 10 wide receivers in free agency, we have old, reliable Keenan Allen. We don't need to spend too much time here. He's 33 years old now, but if you look at the actual usage, he's still earning targets at a pretty elite rate. 122 targets last year. That was 12th in the NFL. Father Time is undefeated, right? I'm not like going to be going out of my way to draft Keenan Allen or anything like that, but he's putting up a pretty big fight that he's going to continue to at least see a nice amount of volume. He had 27% target rate last year. I think he's one of those guys that can give you like a budget safety blanket for a young quarterback. He offers a nice PPR floor late in your fantasy drafts. Pivoting over to the quarterback segment of the free agency list, and if we're going to kind of move a little bit quicker here, I think the first name might actually surprise some people, or at least make some people mad in the comments. I think it's Daniel Jones, like the AKA fantasy cheat code of last year. I think we have to stop thinking about what he was and start thinking a little bit more about what the Colts did to unlock him. We'll see if he ends up back with Indy this year, but averaging 18 fantasy points per game is no joke. That's legitimate starter territory in a 12-team league, and I think that's better than what guys like Trevor Lawrence or Dak Prescott did for at least long stretches of last year. Trevor Lawrence obviously finishing extremely strong, but it wasn't just like the totals, it was how he got there, right? He wasn't just dinking and dunking down the field. He was actually averaging 8.1 yards per attempt, which was 4th in the league, plus the rushing. And yeah, the rushing is what really matters from a fantasy perspective. He had 5 rushing touchdowns. The rushing floor is kind of what keeps him relevant. The Konami code, that's always someone that I'm going to be paying attention to in fantasy. They're mathematically worth a lot more than passing yards in fantasy, of course. And then we get the touchdown upside of him on the ground as well. So the math is heavily favoring these running quarterbacks, which should be not news and definitely should be nothing new. But the risk here is obviously the injury, the late season Achilles and fibula injury. We're going to have to monitor training camp and health reports here a little bit. But if he's healthy, I think he wins a starting job somewhere. And I think he's a starter level fantasy asset solely because of that rushing floor. So if you can draft him at the end of your draft, you might catch a few laughs, but I think it's at least one of those guys that you should be considering depending on his landing spot. Number 2, free agent quarterback Malik Willis. I think this is the pure upside swing, right? It's a small sample size. He only played in 4 games, but the production was huge. So there's going to be someone that wants to chase that in fantasy, in real life, all that good stuff. Week 17, 288 passing yards, 60 rushing yards, 3 total touchdowns. That's a literal definition of Konami code upside. But the question is he actually a good real life quarterback? I think that's what we have to decide here. Or is he just going to be like that fantasy mirage that's going to continue to get him benched over time? I think that's the $1 million question here. He's undeniably very raw, and I think that the rumors are kind of fascinating on which teams that he could fit with. But let's talk about him landing in like a Miami-style motion offense where he just needs to be an athlete, run some play action, and distribute the ball quickly. If he gets that job, if he lands a starting job in a scheme like that, he's definitely high risk, but massive reward type of player for fantasy. He could genuinely be like the QB5, or he could be benched by week 3. There's not going to be much in between there. I think you draft him with your last pick and find out. And he's one of those guys that could give you a lot of upside depending on landing spot. This is one of the ones that I'm the most excited to figure out where he goes. We have a legend at number 3, Aaron Rodgers. We get that vet floor, right? The reality is Aaron Rodgers is still a top 15 passer in this league. His true passer rating was 99.1, so he can still spin the rock. But for fantasy, I guess for the limitation for fantasy players, it's really just his legs. The rushing upside is virtually non-existent at this point, so he's basically a statue out there. He's going to give you like a lot of efficient games through the air. He's not going to throw a lot of interceptions. He's going to continue to play safe. And from a fantasy perspective, he ends up being like a competent QB2 in most leagues. He's not going to lose you a week, but he's rarely getting, I guess, win them through the air for sure without anything on the ground. So yeah, I think you can kind of stream him when he plays bad defenses, but you can bench him when he plays good defenses. So this one's pretty straightforward. Number 4, Joe Flacco. He's kind of like the complete opposite of what we typically go for at the quarterback position. We like guys that run. We like guys that are efficient, but we just get a ton of volume from Joe Flacco. He's going to be like that quarterback that's just like, screw it, I'm throwing it deep. And I think there's value there for sure. And he's definitely someone that isn't scared to let it rip. He doesn't care about interceptions anymore at all. And I think he plays kind of like he's out at the park. Look at like week 9, 470 yards, 4 touchdowns. That's completely insane, obviously, for a guy like that. He's like the perfect streamer if you think you can project him being in a shootout. And depending on where the landing spot is, he's done really well with some of these elite wide receivers. And I think in general, high volume, high variance. He might throw 3 picks, but he could throw 3 touchdowns as well. Number 5, Russell Wilson. He's really that deep ball specialist, right? So say what you want about Russ. He still throws a beautiful moon ball. Week 2, he put up 450 yards, 3 touchdowns. So the upside is there, even though he ended up losing his starting job. But it did end up being one of those situations where he was battling a hamstring injury. He ended up losing his job to Dart ultimately, and he'll be a free agent. But he's still proof that a bridge quarterback is still someone that could be valuable at times in fantasy. So I think he's worth a look if he lands a starting gig in free agency. Maybe the leash is going to be incredibly short, but still one of those guys that, again, if he can throw deep and he's going to give us some efficiency on that side of the ball and kind of unlock some of these other players on offense, then I think it's one of those ones that, I mean, teams aren't going to be able to quit Russell Wilson. He's still going to have a spot in this league in some capacity. Number 6, we have to talk about Marcus Mariota, who ultimately has been kind of like that primary rushing backup that teams are basically in need of across the board. He had 10.1 air yards per attempt last year as well, which was actually first in the league for backups. But I guess what he's going to give you is him being a very aggressive runner, but also a pretty aggressive thrower when he gets in there. Week 13, he stepped in for Jaden Daniels, put up 24.3 fantasy points, and he's kind of like that top tier streamer if the starter in front of him gets hurt. Number 7, Tyrod Taylor. It's definitely a tier down from Marcus Mariota, but he's essentially a professional quarterback too at this point. He can come off the bench, run a system immediately, and the bonus for fantasy is that he still runs a little bit. He's averaged 4.5 carries per game. He's the pure floor play in deep leagues. Number 8, let's talk about Gardner Minshew as a free agent quarterback. He's kind of like that ultimate insurance policy. He's proven that he can handle a full season. If we just look back at his 2023 stats with the Colts, there was a knee injury scare in week 16 last year, but reports were saying that it was just a bone bruise, that he's fully healthy entering free agency. And he's one of those guys that can still get it done somewhere in the league, most likely as a backup. Speaking of backup quarterbacks, number 9, Carson Wentz. This one feels like complete chaos to me, but at least productive chaos for fantasy. He averaged 243 yards per game, and he had a game-winning touchdown drive playing with a dislocated shoulder. And the toughness, I guess, is a selling point for real NFL teams. It keeps him on the field. I think if we're just going to talk about him from a fantasy perspective, not going to be a relevant asset. I mean, really, no matter where he lands, unless he ends up taking over for the starter. Rounding out our quarterback free agents, number 10, Trey Lance. He's still pretty much a mystery to me, even though we got him in 4 games last year. He had a flash in week 18 with 69 rushing yards, but honestly, unless he miraculously wins a camp battle, he's still only a stash in the deepest of dynasty leagues. Okay, let's move on to the most critical position in fantasy football. In segment 3, we're going to talk about free agent running backs, the workhorse, the values, all of those. We want volume though, ideally. Red zone access is something that obviously is a plus. We want efficiency, all those things, but volume is where leagues are won and lost at this position. You can fake it a little bit at the quarterback position. You can stream tight ends. You can end up with these wide receivers that end up on good teams with good quarterbacks and end up seeing more volume, all of that. But if you don't really have good running backs from a fantasy perspective, you could end up basically be drawing dead by week 6. All right, the number 1 running back on my board for free agency is Breece Hall, who was kind of like a star in limbo last year for the Jets. There was like this huge narrative around him where he was basically wasting his talent. And last year, like the team was a total dumpster fire, right? Last year, he was still quietly putting up over 1,400 yards, and that's kind of a wasted season for him. And for fantasy owners, a lot of them, it's a wasted season as well. And it kind of shows how incredibly good he is, that the usage was still elite when the team was basically down most of the season. 243 carries, 48 targets, true 3-down dual threat. But the metric that really pops for me is that proves his talent is really system independent, and it's the breakaway run rate. So we're looking at 17 breakaway runs, which is defined as runs of 15 or more yards. That was 4th in the entire league. So even when the offensive line totally collapsed in front of him, he was creating his own explosive plays. So it isn't like dependent on perfect blocking to get that chunk yardage. He's likely to get franchise tagged by the Jets, but if he moves or even if he stays, and they improve, I guess, the situation even slightly, he's a top 3 overall fantasy running back. And I think he could be a generational superstar depending on the landing spot. Number 2, can't believe we're talking about him as a free agent after being the Super Bowl MVP, but Kenneth Walker, the playoffs, he just absolutely exploded when Zach Charbonnet went down. We literally saw it right in front of us. Super Bowl MVP, 27 carries, 135 yards on the biggest stage in sports. He looked completely unstoppable. But I have to ask if there's a little bit of recency bias tax that we're going to have to pay in drafts, because at least basically we all remember is the playoffs, and we don't remember the inconsistency that we had in the Seattle situation. But this could actually be a good thing, because if he ends up in a better situation where he's like the true workhorse back, we already know the talent, right? And his ADP is going to absolutely skyrocket in August because of that primetime game that we had as our most recent memory. The underlying stats, though, fully support Kenneth Walker as being one of those guys that should be very high up on this list. Number 1 in juke rate in the NFL. Number 1. He misses tackles better than anyone alive right now. He's elite after contact. The massive value here is that Seattle is highly unlikely to use the franchise tag on him because of the cost. So if he goes to a team in free agency that actually features him, kind of what I was just talking about, he doesn't have to like awkwardly split touches with someone like Zach Charbonnet, who's just going to steal touchdowns, all of that. He could be running back 1 overall type material. His skill set in general could be that good. Number 3 is Rico Dowdle. And if we're just looking at the kind of hidden workhorse ability, I think a lot of people still might be kind of sleeping on him in drafts this coming season because he doesn't have a sexy brand name. He really doesn't have that sexy of raw numbers. 1,300 total yards, 39 catches, pretty quiet production at times. And obviously he exploded for a stretch during the season as well for the Panthers. So I feel like no one really talked about him last year all year. Outside of that one stretch, he was pretty quiet, but he was highly effective. And then one of the things that I want to really pay attention to on the metric side, especially for running backs in the free agency class, is yards created. So that's a metric that measures the yards that running backs can generate after the first missed tackle, or like when the blocking kind of breaks down a little bit. So if we're looking at guys that separate from what gets blocked and can actually create on their own, these are the guys that are actually a little bit more talented and can still basically survive despite what the system, or basically what the new system, could look like. So 11th in the league in yards per created for Dowdle. And I think if we're just talking about him leaving his current situation, that was mostly a split with Chuba Hubbard, there could be some rumors in general that could link him to like the Chiefs or the Saints. So it's a kind of a large spectrum of teams that he could land on. And I think that he could end up being kind of a cheap running back in the middle rounds that you could steal if he ends up in a situation where he's going to get a little bit more volume. And I think if he does, he's going to probably take advantage of it. The next guy that was going to be on this list was Javonte Williams, but he has signed a 3-year, $24 million extension with Dallas, so he will remain a Cowboy. And I think that he's one of those guys that I definitely got wrong last year. And just looking at him coming off, I guess, 1 year addition removed from that knee injury was really huge for him. And I think it's one of those guys that could end up being a nice bargain in fantasy because we still don't actually believe what we saw. But Dallas has actually been running the ball a lot more near the goal line than we've seen in years past. So I think he's one of those guys that we don't overthink it. And we just draft into an elite offensive situation and hope for the best. My number 5 running back free agent is Travis Etienne. He's got that 3-down grinder skill set, looking at the volume that he commanded last year, 260 carries, 52 targets. That's truly a rare workload, at least in today's NFL, where literally everyone uses kind of a committee approach. And he found the end zone 13 times, which was 7th in the league. He's very likely going to be leaving Jacksonville in free agency. He's kind of like that pure volume buy. I know people are complaining a little bit about his efficiency last year, which is true. Might not be the most efficient runner anymore, but his yards per carry definitely dipped a little bit. I don't know if we care so much about yards per carry in fantasy as much as we care about touches, though. Volume is going to remain king here, and I think wherever he goes, they're going to be paying him to get the rock 20 times a game. Number 6, J.K. Dobbins. When this guy actually plays football, he's pretty electric. We could call him the efficiency king if we really wanted to. 4.8 true yards per carry, which was 7th in the league, but when he actually plays is part of the massive kicker here, because it feels like we're always having the exact conversation every single year with Dobbins. It's pretty tragic. The foot injury ended his season early again. He's super risky, but like really that high reward RB2 flex play is squarely in play here, depending on where he ends up. If he stays healthy, he could win you weeks because he breaks long runs consistently. But if he doesn't And if he doesn't, well, you know the story. Number 7, Tyler Algier, kind of the starter in hiding on this list, in my opinion. He put up 8 touchdowns on very limited carries while stuck behind Bijan Robinson in Atlanta, of course. He feels like the guy who just desperately needs his own backfield at this point. He runs super violently, and I think the free agent market is going to value him as a starting caliber player. And the prediction here is that he gets paid by a needy team to kind of be their early down hammer. If you're already in the streets, he's kind of a fantastic target for zero RB. I think if you load up on receivers early, you draft running backs late, he's the exact type of ambiguous type of running back with a lot of talent that you could be drafting, and they hope, I guess, in the hope that they secure a clear starting gig in August. My number 8 free agent running back is Kenneth Gainwell, kind of like that PPR specialist. I think if we're just talking about him in general, we have to start with his 73 catches, and that was 4th among all running backs. He's basically a starting wide receiver sitting in your running back slot with an absolutely massive floor. He averaged 1.11 fantasy points per opportunity, which was 2nd in the entire league. He has that perfect PPR floor. And he proved that he can handle lead work if the starter goes down. Number 9, Isaiah Pacheco. We'll call him the angry runner. 2025 was a pretty messy year in general for this guy. He dealt with a lingering injury, found himself in kind of a weird timeshare in Kansas City, but we did see the ceiling flash in week 16, 8 carries plus 6 catches. He runs like he's personally mad at the grass, which is pretty fun to watch. It's really one of those situations, though, where I think he could be a 1A or a very strong 1B in a committee elsewhere next year, and he's kind of that great post-hype sleeper. The casuals in your league are probably just going to fail him ultimately because of that bad season, but the talent is absolutely still there, and I think he's someone that in the right situation could still make a fantasy impact. Number 10, Brian Robinson Jr. He's kind of like that committee plus back. He was stuck behind Christian McCaffrey in San Francisco last year after the trade. Tough place to get touches overall, very tough. But in 2023 and early 2024, that production clearly shows that he can carry the load. He's an excellent handcuff with the benefit of a guy who can kind of lead a 2-man committee or get some goal line work, be active in the passing game, all of those things. So I think that he's one of those guys too that we're looking pretty closely at landing spot here, and it can't be a downgrade if anything. All right, let's bring this thing home with the final segment, segment 4. We're talking tight ends and we're talking about touchdowns, market shares, all of those things. It's kind of a fantasy wasteland out there in fantasy for the position. So we're going to try and find at least some elite traits in free agency, even though it is a little bit of a wasteland. I think we're talking about separation, red zone targets. That's the entire game at tight end. So if you don't secure one of the top guys, you're kind of just praying that your guy falls into the end zone. Number 1 on the tight end list is Kyle Pitts, and he's going to get franchise tags. So it's someone that we can move on from, but he is one of those guys that I thought we should at least highlight on this list as the clear number 1 option. 118 targets, which was 2nd among all tight ends, 22.7% target share. I think he's finally back. I think we can trust him in the early rounds, and I think that the data usage is something that isn't going to lie. I think we can treat him as a high-end tight end going forward, a set it and forget it tight end 1. The volume is truly undeniable now, and we saw what the ceiling was at the end of last year. Number 2, David Njoku. Obviously, over time, he's been a little bit of a volume magnet, but he did see a noticeable dip in volume last year in 2025 because the Browns kind of phased him out in favor of their rookie, Harold Fannin. I do think that it was interesting that they didn't even try and move him at the deadline. It made no sense to me that they waited for free agency as he was clearly going to walk. So it feels like a classic buy low situation for fantasy. He's proven that he can have like that elite production when he's actually featured in an offense. And if you put him on a new team, maybe the Chargers or the Commanders, or maybe he bops back into like that top 5 status immediately, and he's one of those guys that we wish we didn't ignore. Number 3, Dallas Goedert. We talked about it at tight end. We need touchdowns. We're touchdown hunting, and 11 touchdowns last year from Dallas Goedert was 1st among all tight ends, and he just lives in the end zone. He had 15 red zone targets, so if you decide to punt the tight end position in your draft, or at least not draft someone in the first few rounds, which is a total viable strategy, I think you can buy Goddard late just for the pure touchdown equity alone. Number 4, Travis Kelce. This is one of those ones where we'll see if he ends up back in Kansas City or somewhere else, but he still had 108 targets last year, which is tight end 4 overall at a position where volume is certainly harder to come by. He's still finding space. He's still kind of finding those soft spots in zone, and he does it better than almost anyone at the position still. He was also top 3 in yards after the catch at the position, which seems crazy because I don't remember a ton of big plays from Kelce last year, but he's still a very safe volume-based floor play, even if the absolute ceiling isn't what he used to. I don't think he's going to be like the tight end 1 overall or anything like that, but he's not going to absolutely kill your lineup anyways. My number 5 tight end free agent is Isaiah Likely, the metrics darling of the offseason. He was 4th in the open score metric, 2.27 yards of separation per target. That's one of the things that I look at the tight end position in particular, but he's basically stuck in Baltimore in a timeshare and also in a team for a team that's just not going to throw the ball a ton in general. I think that if we're just looking at him splitting that role with Mark Andrews, it's not great. But if he leaves in free agency, or I guess if Andrews' health declines even further, he has a legitimate top 5 tight end potential. I think that if we keep a close eye on this landing spot, we could be in a situation where he vaults up draft boards pretty quickly. Number 6, Zach Ertz, the safety blanket. He had a 20.2% target share before that knee injury last year, but the ACL ended his season. He likely misses the start of 2026, but he could be like a waiver wire stash for later in the season. So I wanted to at least put him on this list. If he does get picked up by someone else, we'll be keeping an eye on that. Number 7, Cade Otton. He had 480 routes run last year, 59 catches. He literally never leaves the field. Pretty boring guy, but more of a set it and forget it low-end tight end 1. He's definitely not sexy, but very useful. Number 8, tight end free agent, Noah Fant. This is one that I thought was kind of interesting to dig into. He was actually number 1 in target separation among tight ends last year, 2.78 yards per target. And I think that if he wants to be one of those guys that was a fantasy relevant player again, we kind of have to look back to the inconsistent usage, and there's definitely some red flags there. But in deeper leagues, he's kind of a sleeper because the underlying metrics for separation actually look pretty favorable if he does get a fresh start. Speaking of fresh starts, Darren Waller at number 9. He's one of those red zone specialists, but that's kind of all you need at this position in general. 6 touchdowns, only 34 targets, wildly inefficient overall. But if he can stay on the field, that's like the inherent risk here. I think that he's a pure touchdown dependent streamer, but if you play him as he's healthy, you could drop him immediately into a situation where he can go and score touchdowns. And you can't really say that for many players at this position. I think that if we're just talking about his ultimately very low floor, that's fair. Realistically, a relatively low ceiling as well, unless he scores multiple touchdowns. But there's not a lot of players that can actually give you the type of upside that he can in the red zone. Number 10, Austin Hooper. He's a veteran playoff experienced player, extremely low ceiling, strictly a depth piece for bye week, so not as relevant for fantasy, but still makes the list.